welcome back to the Point of Order podcast. I'm your host, Assemblyman Josh Hoover from District 7. This is an inside look at California politics in the state legislature, and I'm really excited today to be joined by our first guest, who is a local elected official. She is Folsom City Councilmember Sarah Aquino. Sarah Aquino was first elected to the City Council in 2018 and was reelected in 2022. She was chosen by her colleagues to serve as vice mayor in 2019, mayor in 2020, and vice mayor again in 2021. Prior to her election to the Folsom City Council, Sarah served 4 years as a member of the Board of Education for the Folsom Cordova Unified School District, which is also where I served after she left. And Sarah, how are you today? Thanks for being here.
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. I'm honored to be the first local person on here.
Absolutely, yeah. So tell us a little bit about yourself and your city, our city. I live in Folsom too, but tell us a little about what's going on in the city of Folsom.
Yeah, things are booming in the city of Folsom. Lots of growth happening south of 50. Last Thursday, we had our first groundbreaking for the first park that's going to be south of 50, the first of 9 parks.
That's right.
So we broke ground there, and then we had a little bike caravan where we rode our bikes behind the fire truck, and we went over to what's going to be Station 34, Fire Station 34. So
that's awesome.
Lots of growth happening there. Both UC Davis and Dignity Health bought some property south of 50, and they got lots of earth moving over there. Plans for medical office buildings first, hopefully followed by hospitals in the not too distant future. Also, the first retail shops south of 50 are going to open later this month, and you can see that building is taking shape. But we're also doing a lot of stuff north of the freeway, and we recently put together a committee to do a river district master plan. The city of Folsom is fortunate to be situated alongside Folsom Lake and Lake Natoma. And obviously the majority of that property is owned or managed by the state and federal government, but the city does have some property.
That's exciting.
And so just want to make sure that we are taking full advantage of being alongside the water there.
Absolutely.
Also, hiring a consultant and also going to do a committee to work on revitalizing what we call our central business district. So the area that includes, Target and Lowe's and Walmart and that sort of thing. And we just want to make sure that those property owners and those merchants and the public know that we have not forgotten about that area, that we want to invest in that area, even as the city continues to grow in other directions. So I think the first thing it needs is a rebranding. It's not just a business district anymore. There is housing in there. So
yeah, that's where I live. So
yeah,
I'm very excited about that.
And I have a 22-year-old and an almost 19-year-old, and you think about where they will end up when they graduate from high school and college and all that sort of stuff. And so maybe creating some sort of walkable, eclectic, funky, kind of urban feel within a suburban city. Maybe that will appeal to my kids and other kids.
And that would be down East Bidwell, or what would?
Yeah, it basically in between Blue Ravine to Sutter Middle School, and then East Bidwell to Riley would be considered the boundaries.
Very cool. Yeah, just so much going on in Folsom. It's really incredible. I actually got a chance the other day to meet with Kaiser, and they told me they're breaking ground on their in the Palladio Mall there. They've got their property that they're breaking ground on. So all these next year, I believe. So all these new kind of Folsom becoming this healthcare corridor for 50, Highway 50, I think is really, really fantastic. So I'm super excited about that. And then you also have some ties to the legislature. So you want to tell us about that? I know your dad served in the state Senate.
So my dad held elected office in this region for 22 years. He started on the SMUD board, served there for 4 years. That was back when the SMUD board was the wild, wild west. Luckily, they've come a long way and now are a very stable public utility organization. Then he served 6 years on the County Board of Supervisors representing the 4th District. And then in 1998, he was elected to represent the 5th Assembly District. So he served 6 years there, which at the time was the maximum that you could do.
We talked about that last week.
Almost half of that time he was the Assembly Republican leader. And then in 2004, he was elected to the state Senate and served there until his death in 2010.
Wow.
And actually, I brought you something.
Oh, wow.
My dad died July 13th, 2010. I think these have been in my garage ever since.
Oh, my gosh.
But my dad especially loved when little school groups and stuff came through.
Yes.
And so these are some pins that are these are the California grizzly bear. They're a little small, but hopefully your eyes are better than mine. And so he loved to hand those out to people who came and visited office, and especially school kids. So
that is amazing.
Those are going from my garage to hopefully your office.
I appreciate it. Thank you. And they will go to good use, but that is so amazing.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that. And, I know your dad was so amazingly well respected on both sides of the aisle. And just, I feel like he's the type of leader that we need more of in California. And
he was definitely a statesman. I think he set an example of what an elected official should be. And you're right. He spent a lot of time trying to cultivate relationships on both sides of the aisle. The climate, I think, was different back then. When my dad was the Assembly Republican leader, they went from 29 seats in the Assembly to 32 out of 80.
Wow. Yeah.
What do you have right now?
18 in the Assembly.
Okay, so a little bit different. And then in the state Senate, I think they were 15 out of 40.
Mm-hmm.
So
and now they're, I believe, 8.
Yeah, and so Democrats and Republicans had to work together. They had to negotiate on things like the budget. In the last couple of months of my dad's life, when his health was obviously failing, he had lots of visitors to the house, including just as many Democrats as Republicans. And every Sunday, our family has dinner together. And my dad was particularly close to a Democratic senator by the name of Senator Gloria Negrete McLeod.
Mm-hmm.
And on quite a few occasions, she joined us for our family dinners on Sunday nights. And once was, when they were kind of hammering out the budget. And I said, I don't understand. Why is it that you two get along so famously? And yet there's so much partisan bickering. And, you can't get a budget passed on time and all this stuff. And my dad said, Sarah, Gloria and I could hammer out that budget in 2 days. And he said, because I would respect the things that are sacred to her. She would respect the things that are sacred to me. And we would compromise on the things in the middle. And it's, I don't think he'd be too happy to see where things are right now.
Yeah. I think that's a great perspective on the whole process. Right. And, but yeah, things are definitely changing, or they have changed. Right.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a few of us that do want to kind of restore some of that. But it has to be more than just a few, it has to be the majority. Right.
Yeah.
So, I'm hopeful that, I think as we continue to try to build bipartisan relationships and things like that, there will be opportunity there. But it gets tricky too, because you have different, a lot of different personalities, right, and a lot of different interests, and people don't all share that perspective. Some people think that, and this is not a one side of the aisle or the other, but some people think that they're in Sacramento to not necessarily work with the other side, but to just kind of fight those partisan battles, right? And so I think it's definitely trickier than it sounds.
Well, and governing is harder than campaigning.
Absolutely,
right?
Absolutely.
And we see that at the local level too. Where some folks never get out of campaign mode into governing mode.
Yeah.
And
And it is an important transition that needs to happen. So. It was great to, I know you served on the school board right before I did, and you left, by the way, just in time.
Yeah, well, you had a much more difficult tenure on the school board than I did. There were many times during the pandemic when I said, I am so thankful to be on the city council and
no
not
longer on the school board.
Yeah.
That was, it's funny, I always say when I look back, I'm very glad that I was there during that time. I had a voice in the process, particularly because my kids were in the schools at that time. So I was very thankful to serve through the pandemic and get our schools reopened. But, there were days when it was like, what have I done?
Yeah.
So
yeah, it is probably the most difficult elected office you can hold for sure.
Yeah. And it's very, underappreciated, I think, as well. So, usually we start by doing kind of a weekly recap of what's been going on in California politics. So, we'll jump right into this. And I'm interested in this first story to get your perspective too, as a local official who benefits from some of these taxes. But on July 1st, so this was Saturday, our gas tax went up another 8%. This was based off of a bill that was passed back in 2017 that actually enacted annual increases in the gas tax. We obviously already pay the highest gas taxes in the nation, but and so my colleagues and I put up an amendment last week that basically would have said we're going to suspend the gas tax increase for this year, give California families a break, not increase it. At this point in time, that was rejected. But I think I'm coming from the perspective where we already pay the highest gas taxes in the nation, but we also drive on the fourth worst roads in the nation. And in Sacramento County, now the City of Folsom has some amazing roads, but Sacramento County as a whole, and a lot of my districts unincorporated, we actually have some of the lowest rated roads in the state. The state has some of the lowest rated roads in the nation. And so my constituents are constantly, coming to me and asking what's going on with the roads. And I'll be honest, it's very frustrating when you're paying the most and you're getting the least in return. And I think that's what's frustrating people even more than the cost of, their gas taxes. But I also know that those are important revenue sources too. But so anyway, I just was curious if you had any thoughts on.
Yeah,
on all of that.
Definitely, the city, we rely on that gas tax and on county transportation tax to rehab our roads. And it's kind of like the Golden Gate Bridge. Once you get through painting it, you got to start over, right? Yeah. And although we do have pretty good roads in Folsom, the backlog is unbelievable.
Absolutely.
But you can definitely tell when you go from a city road, not just Folsom, but other cities, to a county road. Right?
Absolutely.
It's bad. But this type of thing is, this is what makes me kind of cynical about the legislature. It's like, if we can't agree on this, what could we possibly agree on, right? Because we know that folks are hurting financially. We know that the cost of everything is up, including basics like gas and food. Yeah. And so, if you can't agree on this, what can we possibly agree on?
It's frustrating too, because I think we all acknowledge, that costs are going up across the country, but in California, the cost of living is, I think, is pretty out of control. And I know that that's where I feel like we've kind of lost track.
Yeah. And again, I was, talking about kids, where are they going to live after they graduate from college and stuff. I mean, how are our kids supposed to afford a house in the state of California? Luckily, when my kids got their first jobs, I made them open up a Roth IRA each. And they're really diligent about contributing to that and their savings account and stuff. And I keep telling them what my daughter has now recently graduated from college, and my son just finished his first year at community college. And I said, once Andrew graduates, you guys, you got to buy a house together. You got to get a couple roommates and just get into that real estate market. And then, but it'll be tough, and it certainly won't be in Folsom.
I think that's the problem, right? I think about this all the time is I don't see a world where my kids are able to come back unless they're doing very, very well very early. But I mean, Folsom's an amazing place for raising a family. That's like why people come to Folsom. Right. And yet, it's probably going to be out of reach for a lot of families, including potentially my own, right? So that is a really hard thing to think about, and that's why I really, I'm glad to see Folsom growing. I think housing supply is a part of that solution, right? Making sure we have more housing for the families that are coming in, but there's so many other costs across the board too that need to be looked at, whether it's gas or energy costs or food costs. I mean, all of those things are skyrocketing in California too. And a lot of it is because of policies that we pass. Right. So, so another one I wanted to get your take on, because you came, did serve in education, prior to, the city council. So we debated a bill this week that would, that will potentially, if it continues to move forward, allow for kind of increased penalties for harassment or threats towards teachers or school employees after school hours. And I will preface this by saying, I supported the bill, and I do not support, harassment or threats towards school employees. So I didn't have a problem supporting the bill. But I also kind of made the comment that, and the bill is somewhat aimed at turning down the temperature of school politics, right? Because we have, a lot of passionate issues that are being discussed at the school level, at the district level. And, I kind of made the additional point, like, I'm happy to support this bill, but if we really want to turn down the temperature of school politics, I think we need to get politics out of the classroom. We need to get back to actually teaching our kids how to read and write. Our schools, we have some pretty great schools in Folsom, but even in Folsom, Cordova, we have schools in Rancho Cordova that are struggling. We are, as a state, we're 50th in literacy in the country. I think where we need to be focused is on getting back to the basics and back to educating kids, and yet we seem to get all these political discussions injected into our classrooms instead. And I think that would go a long way in turning down the temperature as well. But I wanted to get your thoughts on kind of the school landscape right now and how you view things.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the good things to come out of COVID is that there are more parents paying attention to what's happening at the school board level, right? When I was on the school board, you had staff in the audience and you had a couple of those diehard parents who would come to every meeting because they just like to be informed. But you wouldn't have people on there on a regular basis. You just have people there if there was some sort of controversial issue on the agenda. So the fact that more people are paying attention, I think, is a good thing.
Absolutely.
And I think the majority of those parents are respectful in their comments and in their actions.
Majority.
Yeah. Those who aren't, shame on them. We ought to be modeling the behavior that we want to see from our kids. But you can take care of those things.
Yeah.
I agree. In terms of getting back to the basics, the whole reading, writing, arithmetic thing, we pile on all these other things, health and ethnic studies and, all these things that are important, but the school day doesn't get any longer.
No, it
so
doesn't.
Something's
got to give.
Right?
Exactly.
And it's tough. And then the whole thing about, the bill that you were talking about, this whole thing in California and maybe society in general where we have removed consequences for bad behavior is just, we are doomed as a society if we keep going down this direction. And it's so frustrating to see that has trickled down into the education system where you can no longer suspend or expel a child for willful defiance.
Right.
I remember when I was on the school board, they wanted to take away the penalty, maybe it was suspension or something at the time, for marijuana use. And it's like, you know what? Kids have to have consequences. Adults have to have consequences for bad behavior. That's how you learn. And hopefully, if you learn the lesson early enough, you will not repeat it in the future.
And it makes it harder for teachers, right, to control their classrooms if they don't have any authority to, crack down on bad behavior.
Yeah.
But I think the trickle effect is kind of a good point because we've seen this in our, criminal justice policy where we've kind of, with Prop 47 and a number of different things we've talked about in the past on this podcast, we've kind of reduced consequences and accountability in our criminal justice system. And that has kind of trickled down into school policy too.
Yep. So my husband actually just retired from teaching. He spent 27 years at Arden Middle School in the San Juan district and absolutely loved his job. He was a PE teacher, both general ed and special ed, loved his job. Yeah. But it had been very frustrating for teachers since the pandemic, especially where there was no discipline. Yeah. And, typically that's the job of, like the vice principal and there was just so much, the kids have been through so much. Let's give them, some slack. Let's cut them. Yeah. And it's like, okay, at what point are we going to start, enforcing these consequences?
Well, again? And that's kind of a slippery slope too, because, if you do that for a short period and then you try to go back, it's a lot harder. I feel like I know that's how it is for my kids. Yep. If I let them slide for too long, that becomes the norm, right? Yep. So, I think that's a great point. And I think that, I do worry about the future of our, or the quality really of our education system as a whole, because I think the kids that are most harmed by it are the kids that need the most help. The kids with the greatest socioeconomic challenges, the kids in neighborhoods where, they don't have a lot of other educational options. And I definitely am concerned for them. And, the reality is, and we don't need to get into the school choice discussion, but when you talk about school choice and you talk about, having options, people with means have all the choice in the world because they can move, they can afford a home. We were just talking about affording a home. They can afford a home in a neighborhood with a great traditional public school. Maybe they can afford private school tuition for their child. But it's really the kids and the families that don't have those abilities that are trapped in these, in a lot of cases, struggling public schools. And we need to do more to lift them up. And that includes lifting up their school, right? So I'm, something I'm definitely really passionate about. But well, there was some, and we don't usually get into federal issues on this podcast. This is a state level podcast, but I wanted to bring this up because the governor actually reacted to this Supreme Court decision this week. And I wanted to kind of read you his tweet and get your take on it. But there were some pretty huge Supreme Court decisions this week. I think it was the final week of their session. And usually that's when they drop all the big ones. So we won't go into like a big in-depth look at all the decisions, but one of the biggest ones that came out was this ruling on affirmative action in higher education. On a 6-3 vote, the Supreme Court basically said that race cannot be used as a factor when considering admission to higher education institutions in the United States. I personally think it was the right decision, but I wanted to kind of read you the governor's reaction. And so as soon as this broke, he tweeted out, they want to whitewash our nation's history. They want to bring back America. They want to bring America back to the era of book bans and segregated campuses. We cannot let them. That was his reaction to the Supreme Court ruling. And there's someone that I follow on Twitter as well put out where Californians believe. So this is where I was really interested to see the reaction from the governor and from a number of folks. This became a very partisan kind of reaction, like on both sides, where it was, the left was kind of decrying it. And it was really interesting because when we voted in 2020 on Prop 16, so in California, affirmative action has been illegal in higher institution
since the
90s. Yeah, it was like 96 or 97. And voters back then voted to get rid of affirmative action in California. When it was attempted in 2020 there was an initiative put forward to repeal that. It was Proposition 16, and voters again rejected repealing that. So basically, they kept affirmative action out of higher education on a 57 to 43% vote. And I thought this was really fascinating. There were, of the 58 counties in California, only 6 actually supported repealing affirmative action in California. The other 52 counties did not. And so I was kind of actually surprised by the governor's reaction because the state has made it so clear on where they stand and the voters have made it so clear on where they stand. But anyway, I was just curious what your thoughts might be.
Yeah. And I guess for me, I can kind of see it both ways. I mean, yes, ideally people would be accepted to a college or university based on their qualifications only. But we also know you might get into a school because your family has a history at that school, right?
Legacy admissions,
or because
absolutely.
You're a stellar athlete or, musician or artist or whatever.
Sure.
So it seems a little bit disingenuous to, on one hand, decry somebody getting in because of, race or something. And then on the other hand, we have these
We're
legacy
okay with
things.
all these other things.
It doesn't seem quite right. I'm a little bit jaded, I would say, on the whole college admission process anyway.
You've kind of been through this, right?
So, as I said, my son just finished his first year at community college, wasn't really sure what he wanted to do or be or, major in. So he decided that was the path for him, and it's worked out great. He'll do 1 more year at Folsom Lake, and then he'll transfer to a 4-year. Now, my daughter always knew that she wanted to be a music major. Straight A's in high school, passed all of the AP tests that she took with a 5 in most of them. If not a 5, they're probably then a 4. And yet there were CSUs that she did not get into.
Wow.
And you just kind of wonder, when you've got kids at the same high school taking the same classes from the same teachers, and one gets in and one doesn't. Was it the essay? I think back then you were still taking the SATs. So, I don't know exactly what it was. Yeah. It just doesn't seem like there's a lot of rhyme or reason. And then you hear about all these out-of-state kids coming to California schools, and so I'm a little bit jaded anyway. It ended up working out really well for her. She ended up going to a private university. She got a ton of scholarship money. And that is where she found her passion. As you know, she plays in a couple mariachis. And that probably would not have happened if she hadn't have gone to school at UOP. And so things tend, I think, to work out for a reason. But, I think there are the fact of the matter is, the playing field isn't always level and kids don't always have the same opportunities. And I think there are some things that we could do, as school board members or former school board members that can help create opportunities for kids. So let me give you a little bit of an example. I remember when I was on the school board, we were talking about the criteria for taking honors math in middle school. Yeah. And honors math, it's the same curriculum, but it's accelerated. So you do like 2 years worth of math in 1 year. And I remember talking to a math teacher who is now retired, but he was just an outstanding teacher. The kids loved him and really, really connected with him. And he told me, he said, we've got this completely backwards. He said, we require that you test in to take honors math in 6th grade. He said, we ought to open it up and say, you want to take honors math in 6th grade? Great. You've got that drive, you've got that ambition, you think you can do it. Let's welcome them all. Yeah. And then if they can't cut it, maybe we say you have to have a B or better going forward, or a C+ or better going forward, or whatever, right? But don't put that barrier in there at the beginning. Yep. Give everybody who wants to the opportunity to try. Yeah. And so I think those are some things that we could, some changes that we can make so that maybe to level the playing field and to give people all of the opportunity so that someday, maybe it can just be based on who's the most qualified.
Well, and also just, continuing to challenge kids. And, I feel like what we've kind of done in the education space is continue to kind of lower the bar instead of raise the kids up. We actually bring the bar down. And I think that's where, I think we need to have, high expectations, but at the same time, actually give kids the tools to meet those expectations and to meet that bar. I don't think it actually helps kids when we're, actually, saying, well, you're not, this school or this group is not meeting the correct metrics. So we need to we need to reduce the expectations. I actually think that harms them in the long run. And we need to do more to actually give them the tools to lift them up. And I think that, so there are certainly a lot of things we can do from a policy standpoint. And also, even from an admissions standpoint, California has operated this way for, I think that's one of the, things I found so interesting about the governor's reaction. This is how California has operated for the last, 30 years or, 26 years or something, right? So there's certainly ways to help kids in disadvantaged communities or kids that, had a harder upbringing to help them succeed in higher education. But, it doesn't have to be based on their race, right? Or their skin color, which I think is.
I have a little bit of a problem when people say, well, because of this person's race, they're taking away a spot from a more deserving student. The truth is there are so many students who would do well, who could handle, that environment, that university, but they weren't accepted, right? Yeah. And so, again, I see both ways on this one. The one that I was really happy to see the Supreme Court rule on the way they did was the not the student loan.
Was it the student loan one? I was going to say that was the one.
I'm all about trying to give people opportunities, but when you make a choice to do something and you take on that debt, sorry, that's your responsibility.
That, and I was happy to see that as well. I always thought that was going to get struck down. What I was really surprised by is that was also a 6-3 ruling. I thought that should have been a 9-0 ruling, particularly because the former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, at the time had herself said this was illegal. There was really no question from either side that this was on shaky legal ground when it was attempted. And it's not so much about the student loan payoff. It was about it coming from the executive branch versus coming from Congress, right? The executive branch has limited powers. It's really Congress's job to pass a policy change like that. And if Congress wants to have that discussion, let's have that discussion. Right. But for the president to do it unilaterally, that was the part that was, questionable.
Right.
And so and pretty much everyone agreed on that at the time. and now, that's also being decried as some sort, but it's like everyone agreed that was on shaky legal ground from the very beginning.
Yeah.
So, it's really interesting. I think that's what's, just to hit you with a quick statistic here, that's what's frustrating to me about the rhetoric around the Supreme Court. And this has been the case, but, it's kind of being called this like out of control court or something like that. 50% of the decisions this session were unanimous, the Supreme Court. 92% of the decisions had people from both sides of the political spectrum in agreement. Only 8% of the decisions this session actually were 6-3 decisions. And so, I feel like, again, it's kind of this outrage machine, right? that continues to pump. And I think it's not good for our politics. It's not good for bringing people together. It's not good for bipartisan cooperation either. But, everyone's focused on those 8% versus the 92% where there was actually agreement on both sides of the political spectrum. So I just thought that was interesting. All right, last story in our weekly recap, and then we'll move on to another segment. This one, the news came out, Governor Newsom has doubled the state police presence in San Francisco to crack down on fentanyl. His quote in this article was, "I'm not going back to the old failed war on drugs, but I'm also not naive about the fact that we've got to triage what's happening on the streets. Open air drug dealing is unacceptable." I agree with him.
Yeah. On that we can agree.
But, we've been talking, I feel like San Francisco has kind of been a theme on this podcast because every week there's some new story. And as a local city council member, I kind of just wanted to get your perspective on, how does Folsom approach, issues like this? I know we have fentanyl is kind of infiltrating the whole state, but I feel like in San Francisco, it has almost been allowed to a certain degree, kind of this open air drug use that I agree needs to end. But I was just curious on your thoughts on this story, but also on just how you're dealing with it at the local level.
Yeah, and we do see it. You hear about maybe some kids that went to school with your kids or something, or I read the police logs regularly, and once in a while you'll see that Narcan was successfully administered or something like that. And then we do use canines, and they have been successful in sniffing out some of those pills. It's it's scary for sure, and especially when you're raising kids. I agree with the governor on that. I think I don't know why we have such an issue. I don't know if other countries have the same fentanyl crisis that we do. But I would say just this whole lack of consequences that it kind of goes along with the homeless, and I think it goes along with the legalization of other drugs. I think 21 states now have legalized marijuana. And certainly I understand that people use that, because they're going through chemo or whatever. I mean, I think there are legitimate uses. But I also think we haven't even seen the tip of the iceberg when it comes to mental health issues that we're going to see because, younger kids are using it and the potency is so much greater than it was, when we were growing up. And so I think this is the very, very beginning. And that's scary.
Yeah. Well, and I think the fentanyl issue in particular is scary because it's not something that, if you purchase marijuana, like, you're getting marijuana. And in the case of fentanyl, I mean, there are fentanyl users potentially knowing that they're using fentanyl, but for our kids, in a lot of cases, they think that they're purchasing some other substance and it's fentanyl. and that's and it's killing kids.
Yeah.
I mean, in large numbers.
Yeah,
so.
I think the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office says that 98% of the pills they get off the street are counterfeit, and 98% of them have fentanyl. And so, the message to your kids has to be: you cannot experiment. You cannot take anything that does not come from a legitimate pharmacy. You just can't do it.
I feel like in that way, it is scarier than when we were growing up, because while that experimentation was frowned upon, or obviously could get you in a lot of trouble, it wasn't lethal, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's where, I have met with parents that have lost children, and it is one of the most heartbreaking things you can imagine. And so, I'm glad to see this. I will say, I think it's a bad look that San Francisco had to get to the point that it's gotten for this action to be taken. I think this is a good example of when you just allow things to just slide, and you get rid of consequences, and you allow encampments to take over your city. This is kind of the actions you have to take, these extreme actions to stop it. And I think a lot of those policy decisions could have been avoided much earlier had they just made better policy decisions, or those outcomes, I should say. So anyway, it's going to be an interesting and ongoing topic on this podcast, I think. So I'm going to play you. So we're going to move on to our clip of the week. So we had kind of a big week last week. We swore in the 71st Assembly Speaker, Robert Rivas from Salinas. This has been kind of another topic we've been talking about. Robert is, when I got sworn in on December 5th, we actually voted on a resolution. And this was pretty unprecedented, where the speaker at the time, Anthony Rendon, was the speaker. And then Robert Rivas in the resolution was called the speaker designee, I think. And he was, in the resolution, it said he would take over in June of 2023. And so that has now taken place. Yeah.
So you had a succession plan. That's,
It was interesting.
Yeah.
It was more unique than I think the Assembly has done it in the past, but it ended up happening. And so he was sworn in this week. I wanted to get your thoughts on just a bit of his speech here. We'll play this and then come back and get your thoughts.
Yes, California is the most populous state in the country. Yes, California is the fourth largest economy in the world. But if we, in this room, if we do not act and act with greater urgency, it will get more and more difficult to build a good life here. I feel, and I know that you all do too, a great sense of responsibility. Responsibility because we are the ones who can keep the door open for the next generation. We are responsible for protecting the building blocks of Californians' everyday lives, from the water we drink to the air we breathe, from children's schools to our public hospitals. It is on us. And to face these challenges, we must return our attention to the basics. We must elevate California's working and middle classes by enacting practical measures that will lift the economic burden they face. We must make our public services the best in America. We should have the best schools, roads, hospitals, and we don't. It's time to ask ourselves why that is and take real action, even when it's tough or unpopular to fix it. We must use every tool at our disposal to end homelessness, because the inhumane conditions on our streets are completely unacceptable. And we must achieve all of this while continuing to do what California does best: protecting our incredible environment and protecting the right of every Californian to live, to love, to choose, and to thrive. This will mean focusing less on how many bills we can pass and more on the impact we are having. Sometimes this will mean going back and fixing something rather than passing a new law. It may mean saying no to an interest group that has had our back in the past. It may mean reaching out to a colleague whose beliefs are different from our own. What's clear? We must work with urgency and unity. Unity that is backed by mutual trust and respect. And today, I pledge to you to do whatever I can to reinforce these values.
So, any initial thoughts on those comments?
You know, it all sounds very reasonable and very hopeful. But then if you listen a little bit longer, here's the next sentence.
Yeah.
This approach will allow us to make measurable progress on the most critical issues facing Californians, and it will show the rest of the country that progressive government works.
Yep.
And that says to me, more regulation, more mandates, more loss of local control.
Yeah.
And I always say that my philosophy when it comes to governing is the same as parenting. Have as few rules as possible, but enforce them absolutely.
Yeah.
And so I don't think we need more government intervention and oversight. We just need the government to get out of the way.
Totally agree. Yeah. And that certainly is, I will say, while I appreciated a lot of the things in his comments, the speech as a whole was, you know, how can government save us, right? Mm-hmm. How can government get us out of these these challenges, right? And I have not seen evidence that, I mean, look, the reality is that the Assembly Speaker Rivas's party has been in charge for almost 30 years in the legislature, and so these challenges have, you could say, happened on their watch. I think there is a lot that we could do to work together as Democrats and Republicans to solve these challenges, and there's certainly policies we could change to help reverse some of these trends. But it is going to require kind of a larger bipartisan cooperation, I think. And it's going to require to have a little less faith in government and to actually allow businesses to function and to reduce regulations and to, actually enforce laws, which we have not done. In a lot of cases, we've gone in the opposite direction. So, well,
and I think sometimes the mistake people make is to want to be too ambitious and do too much too soon. We didn't become this way overnight, right? It was just a steady, small incremental changes that were made. And so here's an example of something that we recently did in Folsom. So when the pandemic first hit, we suspended some regulations. Maybe they had to do with signage or, things like that to try to help people, because right, people needed to stay in business and all that sort of stuff. And one of the things I said, hey, let's suspend that ordinance that limits the number of garage sales somebody can have, right? Which I don't even know when that got put in the municipal code. And then, 2-3 years goes by, and guess what? Did we get one complaint about somebody having too many garage sales? No. And I said, let's just repeal that thing. And it's so minor, but it's just kind of an example of how we have to just slowly and incrementally start to roll back these regulations. Does the government really need to tell somebody the maximum number of garage sales they can have a year? No. Yeah. If somebody kind of is, being egregious about it and they're having it on every weekend, well, then there are other ways to work that out, Sure. But we don't have to have something on the municipal code that limits the number of garage sales.
That's a great point.
But so it just little things like that, if we can just slowly start to, roll those things back.
Yeah, and I appreciate his comments on, unity, obviously working with people with different beliefs. I think, time will tell on that, whether that actually comes to fruition or not. I loved his comments about we don't need more laws and bills. We talked about last week on the podcast, the Assembly can introduce up to 4,000 bills per 2-year session.
Wow, that's just crazy.
If you multiply the limit times the number of Assembly members per 2-year session, it's 4,000 bills. And this year, I think 2,600 were introduced. Statistically, we had Chris McKaylee on last week. I don't know if you know Chris, but he's a numbers guy, so he was breaking down. But 40% of those statistically will go into law. Those 2,600 bills, 40% has been kind of our track record in California on new bills that get actually through and signed by the governor, which I just think is an astounding number.
It is.
And I
how
can
many
tell
of
you
those
most
aren't even enforceable? Like not being able to get a plastic straw when you go through the drive-through or whatever, unless you ask for it. It's like,
or at a restaurant when you have to ask for the straws. Yeah. No, it's a good question. And I think in California, we pass a lot of bills with certain intentions, but without thinking about, the actual, feasibility or whether or not they're actually going to have their intended result or what the unintended consequences might be. And I know as a local government official, you probably see that all the time. The state will tell you something and then you're like, that's not how the real world works.
But you know what? I also see this in my day job. In my day job, I'm a life and health insurance broker.
Yeah.
And in 2014, when the Affordable Care Act passed, there were some good things and there have been some bad things. But one thing that the state of California did was ban short-term temporary insurance policies because they didn't have the comprehensive coverage that other plans do. But here's the problem with that. When somebody doesn't pay their premium and they get canceled mid-year or whatever, they miss the window where they lose their group coverage and they don't buy their individual plan within a certain window. There's nothing that I can sell them. They are completely out of luck until the next open enrollment period.
Wow.
And so, yes, maybe the short-term temporary plan doesn't cover pre-existing conditions, and in the past they didn't cover prescription drugs, but at least they would have something.
So
that if
coverage.
Tomorrow they got hit by a bus or were diagnosed with cancer or had a heart attack or something, they would have some coverage. But those plans, I can't sell those plans anymore.
Wow.
So now, if you miss the open enrollment period and then in April, whatever, you didn't pay your premium and you lapsed, you're done until January 1st, unless you find a job that has health insurance.
That's incredible.
Or Medi-Cal.
Yeah.
If you qualify. But so, in theory, they thought they were doing something good by saying, hey, these plans aren't comprehensive enough. But now they've literally left some people with no coverage whatsoever.
Wow. That's incredible. Yeah. Well, time will tell. But I thought, I will say I appreciated the tone that he struck in his speech. I didn't agree with everything, but on the homelessness issue, I think he's right on. We have to take urgent action on that. And so that's actually going to segue into our next topic, our final topic. We usually look ahead at kind of what's coming down the pipe. And today, I just wanted to kind of talk to you. I didn't want to let you leave without talking about homelessness because this truly is an issue the local governments are facing across the state. Some communities, obviously, it's a lot worse than others. But there was a big Cal Matters article that dropped I think this week, actually, where they kind of compared Texas and California and their homelessness approaches and their homelessness results. I think so. Last year, Texas recorded a 28% drop in homelessness since 2012. During that same period of time, California's homeless population grew by 43% in the state. And our rate of homelessness per 100,000 residents is 5 times worse than Texas. And this was the part that was really interesting to me. That's despite the fact that Texas spends far fewer dollars on homelessness. Not counting federal money, Texas spent last year $19.7 million, equal to $806 per unhoused person.
Wow.
California, on the other hand, poured $1.85 billion into its 3 main programs, $10,786 for every unhoused person in California, and yet we're getting worse results. And then I'll drop this, and then I'll get your thoughts. But the polling is also very different in the 2 states. In California, it's the number 1 issue on voters' minds. And in Texas, it didn't even crack the top 10 because of how they're managing it. So, what is your perspective on this issue? I know I've got my thoughts, but it's really, I think in California, it is a top issue and it needs to be.
Absolutely, it is. My philosophy when it comes to this is pretty simple. I think to the extent that we can connect people with services, we should. But if they refuse those services for whatever reason, we should not make it convenient or comfortable for them to be homeless in our city or our state. And the frustrating thing to me is that we know what works. Programs like Powerhouse Ministries in Folsom and St. John's Program for Real Change in Sacramento, those work because they're live-in, long-term, rigorous programs that have a requirement that you be sober and drug-free, that you do the hard stuff that is necessary for you to, change your circumstances.
Absolutely.
And some people may listen to this and say, wow, she is cold-hearted, but it's not humane to allow people, to live in a tent or, on the streets. And I think the reason we have to make it uncomfortable and inconvenient for them to be homeless is so that they will want to choose a better option. And here's an example of that. In Folsom, I'm not exactly sure of the timing. It was 7, 8, 9 years ago. There was a woman who was homeless, living out of her car and pregnant. And she was this close to accepting a spot in Powerhouse Ministries residential treatment program. But before she started, she got a phone call to say, we have housing for you. And so instead of choosing Powerhouse and doing the really tough work that probably would have changed the trajectory of her life, she chose the housing where there was no requirement for sobriety or anything like that. Fast forward to today. She's still homeless. She does not have custody of her child. And she is a frequent guest of the winter shelter in Folsom that is housed over 12 weeks by a nonprofit.
Incredible.
And it is just incredible.
It's heartbreaking, really.
Yeah.
I think that's a big part that gets lost in this conversation is, sometimes, we need to challenge people to get their lives back on track. And I think we tend to talk about homelessness as one specific thing with one specific solution. But the reality is that it's far more complicated than that. And that, there are different people with different struggles and need different treatment options. And for some people, that might just be housing, right? If they're not struggling with addiction or mental illness.
Yeah, but those are far and few in between. Right?
True. And I think, and I will say for that group of people, we make it very difficult in California because we already talked about it's so difficult to afford housing. That was actually mentioned too in this article was the median one-bedroom home in the state for rent was $1,233 in Texas, and it was $2,200 in California.
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, that is clearly a barrier for people that if housing is their issue or rent costs are their issue, that is a barrier in California. But there are also a ton of people that need real help, that need to get sober or that need treatment for their mental illness. And we have to be able to address those needs and actually compel them to help themselves. And ignoring that and just allowing them to do whatever they want is not helpful to them. It's not helpful to our communities. And it's really going to perpetuate this cycle that we're seeing in our state. And so I totally agree. I think we have to. Well, and by the way, and I mention this all the time, but those $2 billion or so, or all the billions we've spent in California, none of it can be spent on programs like St. John's, programs that require sobriety because our public policy does not allow it.
Right.
And that is what I think frustrates me the most.
Right.
So
and also one of the things that gets lost, I think, is, in Folsom, the 82,000 residents, who are not homeless have a right to walk down the city sidewalk and not encounter feces or needles or somebody sleeping, right?
Yeah.
They have the right to use our public amenities.
Yeah. Well, and that was the last point in this article that I kind of highlighted was Texas has banned encampments on their streets. They've empowered cities to clear encampments and law enforcement to cite campers that are there illegally. I put forward a bill to do something similar to that in California. It was voted down, even though it's being embraced by cities across our state. So, that certainly is also part of it. And that is, for our residents, they certainly have the right to that. It's also about public safety,
and public health.
And public health. I mean, seriously, I have found needles in our Folsom parks where my kids play. I think everyone agrees that's unacceptable. And, people have to be safe. In Rancho Cordova, we've lost 3 individuals have been murdered in the last year, or in 2022, by unhoused individuals. That is not to say that all unhoused individuals are dangerous people. That is not, we're not painting with a broad brush there, but the reality is that we need these laws in place to keep people safe. And we also need to be getting those people the help that they need. So it's just, it's a very complicated issue. Our new Assembly Speaker mentioned it's a really important issue to address, and I agree with him. I think the question is there the political will there to actually do what's necessary? So I guess time will tell. But all right, so this is our last section. I always do a little just for fun segment to close things out before we wrap up. And I wanted to bring up a story that you made national news during the pandemic by taking a job at a local restaurant when they desperately needed workers. You took a job at Back Bistro, which is this restaurant, amazing restaurant in Folsom in the Palladio. What compelled you to do that? Are you still doing it? Like, tell us how that all came about.
So this was in 2021, and I had been talking with the Folsom Chamber of Commerce, and the feedback that they were getting from businesses is, we don't need you to send business our way. We need you to send employees our way. And so we started talking about, how can we help? And then Jeff Back, who co-owns Back Bistro with his wife, Gail, posted on Facebook that they were in desperate need of hosts and bussers. And so I figured I was just going to lead by example. They had already stopped being open on Mondays, and it's one of my favorite restaurants, and I didn't want to see them have to close any additional days. And so I called up Jeff and I said, hey, I don't have any restaurant experience, but I'm a fast learner and a hard worker, and if you need my help, I will commit to work up to 20 hours a week for 6 months.
That's awesome.
And so he said, well, let me talk to Gail and I'll call you back. And so he called me back in a couple hours and he said, we'll take you. And so I agreed to accept only minimum wage. I don't get any tips. And so for the first couple months, I was working probably 4 nights a week there. I usually would work, 4 to 8 or something like that. And here I am 20 months later and I still work there.
I love it.
Because I love it so much. It's been so much fun. I'm 50 years old. This is my first restaurant job I've ever had.
That's amazing.
The staff is so great.
Yeah.
The food is great. I like working. I think there's value in hard work, and being on your feet for 4 hours and not sitting behind a computer is good. And
you get to interact with people.
That is my favorite part. It is my social hour. So I
awesome.
Typically work Fridays and Saturdays, usually about 4:30 to 8.
Yeah.
If it's slow, they'll let me go. If it's busy, I'll stay longer. But the first thing I do when I get to work is I check the reservation list to see who's coming in, that I know. And I can't tell you how many times I grew up in Fair Oaks. I have lived in Sacramento County uninterrupted since 1976.
Yeah.
And so I see so many people that I went to junior high school with, that I grew up with. They have no idea I work there. They don't live in Folsom. They're just going out to dinner. That's
amazing.
Yeah. So
that is so awesome.
It is a hoot, and they may want to get rid of me before I want to leave. But
that's so amazing that you're still there, though. I thought that that's it. When it happened during the pandemic, it was such a cool story. I mean, it was really cool to see you make national news for something so positive. I think we see so many negative stories.
I think, Yeah, so the city has some sort of service where they track when we're mentioned in news stories and stuff. Yeah. That story was picked up by over 300 newscasts and websites. And they said if we had bought the publicity, it was the equivalent of $1.8 million.
That's incredible.
And I think it was just a feel-good story.
It was a great story. Yeah. And it was so cool to see our city too highlighted, right?
Yeah.
Through your work as mayor there. So I will say, to your point about working in a restaurant, I as much as I love my job now, I think my favorite times of my life were working in a restaurant in college, and just getting to interact. But I'm a social person, right? But getting to engage with restaurant goers, getting to really just kind of with the staff and the team, really getting to get to know your coworkers and have almost like a we're in it together, mentality.
My son is a dishwasher, and I mean, that's character building, right? And when he heads out to work, I tell him, Andrew, you make those dishes shine. So,
that's good. Yeah. Whatever you do, be proud of your work.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Do a good job at it.
That's amazing. Well, thanks for sharing a little bit about that. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I would just remind people to shop local. One of the things that we didn't talk about is, the City of Folsom, just like some other cities and counties, we have seen, that transition to online sales, online shopping, which we still do get some sales tax revenue from that, but not as much as somebody went into a brick and mortar store. So
shop local.
Yeah, shop local. Wherever you are, shop local.
Yeah, no, that is a great tip for leaving the podcast. Couple announcements. Next week, we're going to be joined by Kate Sanchez, Assemblywoman from District 71 in Riverside County. I hope everyone has a wonderful, even though this will probably publish after 4th of July, have a wonderful Independence Day with your family. If you want to share ideas for future shows, you can email pointoforderpod@gmail.com. You can follow and subscribe on YouTube at Point of Order Pod, and follow the podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Point of Order Pod. That's it for today. Sarah, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.